Welcome everyone to the Wild Ones webinar. We have topic today is planning native garden projects in your community, and we have someone speaking today who's been doing so well with that in his community in Laurel. That's Jimmy Rogers of Vibrant Gardening LLC. That is his new native gardening consultancy. He is a member of the Greater Baltimore chapter of Wild Ones. And he's worked with a variety of local organizations in his community to plan and create native gardens. His focus for his business and as a volunteer is to help residential land stewards reduce their lawns and to get more native plants into the ground, of course, and share lasting habitats with local wildlife. So we're going to talk about Wild Ones for a minute, and then Jimmy is going to go ahead and take over. So here we have our Wild Ones chapters. You can see we need to have a lot more chapters on the west side of the country. Hopefully you'll make it over that way pretty soon. We have 94 chapters and 36 seedlings in 36 states. And if you have a friend that might want to join, if you'd like to join officially, you go to join.wildones.org. Right now we have, these are our chapters that we have in Maryland. And we have just started something new where we can actually put some of their events into our calendar as well. So if you follow our calendar from our website or you subscribe to our calendar, you'll be able to see, in addition to our events, you'll be able to see some of the events in the other chapters as well. So we want to, anybody who's not familiar with us or our vision is native plants and natural landscapes thriving in every community. And with hundreds of chapters, the shared mission is advocacy for native landscapes through education and community action. And we like to inspire change through mutual respect for nature and for the earth. We are an inclusive community and we welcome everyone. And we share the latest evidence-informed strategies for your native gardening. And we like to grow the chapter through learning, action, and sharing of knowledge. And we would encourage you to become a volunteer and help us grow. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks to Wild Ones Greater Baltimore for hosting this talk. I'm happy to be speaking with you, especially on this topic of planning native garden projects in your community. And I'm going to turn my video off because my bandwidth has been kind of poor recently. So you'll have to just see pictures of me in the presentation. Oh, look, there's one. So I'm Jimmy Rogers. I'm a native gardener in Laurel, Maryland. In my day job, I'm a project manager, which means I spend as much time on budgets and schedules as I do making sure everyone knows why we're even doing the project. I think you'll see how that comes in handy in gardening projects as well. I'm also a certified Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional, or CBLP, which covers the intersection between gardening, landscaping, ecology, and stormwater management. I'm the Gardens project manager with our local ecological group here, Laurel for the Patuxent. L4P is a nonprofit that works to conserve the Patuxent River, as well as its watershed, which includes all of the homes and woods and animals and plants in and around the city of Laurel. Lastly, it might surprise some of you to hear that I'm the president of a small HOA, Patuxent Triangle. Most folks see HOAs as against conservation-oriented landscaping. However, that's starting to change, both due to Maryland's state law allowing residents to garden for wildlife in HOAs, and because HOAs are themselves realizing that they benefit from better water and land management. After several years of learning and volunteering as much as I possibly could, I realized the only way I could do any more was to start a business. That business is Vibrant Gardening. Screwed up and I can reset. This year, I'm starting a new service called Plant Concierge, where experienced gardeners and project leaders can come to me with a plant list. And if a plant is grown in Maryland for the wholesale market, I can find it and deliver it for about the same cost as you'd see at a typical native nursery. I can also see if local ecotypes are available. Okay, that's enough about me. Let's dive into the topic at hand. So what are we going to cover today? What makes a good gardening project? What are the phases of most projects? Some example projects, and we'll have time at the end for Q&A. I do want to note this won't be a comprehensive overview of how to design and build gardens. So just be aware that, if you have broader designing things, we've actually had talks on that recently, and we'll probably have them in the future. But I'm just going to focus on the project management side. So what makes a good gardening project? Well, you need a people-centric idea, a clear vision, powerful and engaged supporters, which I'm going to refer to as stakeholders throughout this presentation, enough funding, and a plan for stewardship. All right, so there are a lot of different types of community projects. The most common type of project is to put native plants into existing garden beds around buildings. I'll share an example tonight of a museum I worked with. Schools can frankly be a tough type of space, mostly because of the diverse stakeholders, rules, and limited resources for stewardship. Public buildings can be good to work with if there's something in that institution, someone in that institution who is looking for a gardener to partner with. HOAs are increasingly interested in native gardens, and often they have a green team or boards to work with. You can also start super small with a neighbor who is looking for someone to help them make a bigger change than they can carry out on their own. Getting away from buildings, there are a lot of parks that have huge tracts of relatively unused lawn. These are great sites for a new garden, especially if there's a walk-by educational component with signage. It is often the only way to create a large garden near apartment communities. Pictured here is the pollinator garden for Laurel for the Patuxent, created in Larry T. Smith Park in Laurel. You can build gardens alongside existing community garden plots, which are often more vegetable or cut flower oriented. Native gardens attract and house native bees, which are excellent for vegetable pollination, more so than honeybees. Native plantings can help mitigate stormwater issues. Any native garden that receives and absorbs stormwater can be considered a conservation landscape. Rain gardens are similar, but are meant to hold more water hold water a little longer so it can soak into the ground. Once you start thinking about a rain garden, you'll want to get some specialized education or professional help to make sure you've created a long-lasting solution. Some projects involve a restoration phase, such as where the land has become choked with invasive species or where you are rewilding the land from a previously managed situation. Both of these start sliding away from conventional residential gardening and often require a more specialized skill set. All right, so what are the phases of most projects? First is stakeholder engagement and visioning. So who's involved and what does success look like? Project charting is everything we know today, or everything we can know today. Funding is money. Design is planning the details. Implementation is building it. Maintenance is caring for it. And then when you begin planning new projects, you're really creating an initiative out of your initial project. So let's talk about stakeholder engagement and envisioning first. This first phase is sometimes a little hard to talk about because there's a chicken and egg problem. Sometimes you have a great idea and you need to figure out who's going to do it. Or sometimes you have a great team or a resource and you're trying to find out great projects to work on. Stakeholders collaborate to form a vision, but there can be many rounds of thinking and revising that vision, especially as people are found who want to join the project and ultimately want input into that vision. This is good. The worst thing you can do is lock into a vision too early, not engaging newcomers. And then later in the project, you either have stakeholders who become disengaged, or you end up with a vague vision that no one really understands or even agrees upon. I'm going to start with stakeholders first and then talk about visioning. So stakeholders can be drawn from many sources. Obviously yourself, friends and neighbors, nonprofits, public entities such as the government, private organizations, funders, and of course your broader community. I'm mostly using the term key stakeholders here to indicate people you're going to be working with most closely and who have the most impact on the project, or can break ties, and often controls the funding or land use by the project. Their job is to make sure the project happens and that everyone else is unimpeded in their work, especially from a business standpoint. A project coordinator or manager is a great role to have, as it can take a lot of organizational load off of the executive sponsor. They are responsible for helping the team to get through the project phases, identify and avoid risks, manage changes, and they often help the team overcome obstacles. Another great role is the communications coordinator or manager, who can focus on keeping the team informed and or keeping the broader community informed about the project. They can organize a social media or email campaign or design posters or flyers. As a part of the team, it's their job to extract the exciting bits from the project and turn those into communications for the broader group of stakeholders. Then there are just general team members who may not have a specific job, but they show up when you need an extra pair of hands and are included in team level communications. It's best to have at least a few folks in this role, as they can help take pressure off of the others. It's great to have new team members shadow someone else so that they can start becoming the backup for that person. Your project may partner with other groups such as businesses, nonprofits, or a part of the government. They may be tightly connected with the project, or it may even be your executive sponsor. On the other hand, they may just help amplify your message. Either way, it's very important to stay connected with your partners and give them credit when sharing the news of your project's success. Lastly, vendors are essentially partners that you're paying for something. You need to keep them informed about their part of the project as well. There's often a contract or agreement that needs to be negotiated, and generally you'll want your executive sponsor to take the lead on that. There's a special role on garden projects that absolutely must not be overlooked: the land steward. A land steward is someone who takes responsibility for the soil, water, plants, and animals that exist on a piece of land. While you're in the visionary stage of a new public garden project, it's important to identify the land steward. The first part of avoiding bad the first part of this is avoiding bad assumptions about who it is. It's not necessarily the designer, as they may only be involved in the beginning of the project. It's not necessarily the implementation team, as their skills, focus, and energy may revolve only around the initial implementation. It's a poor assumption to look at the organization that owns the property and assume, oh, it will be the president of the board. As a rule, executives and senior staff always have too much on their plate to take the job directly. And the laziest approach to land stewardship is to say, oh, the community will manage it. Even the most community-centric spaces, like community gardening plots, there is always a central person or team responsible for making sure the greater mission and vision of the space is on track, even when it's cold and rainy and nobody is thinking about their personal garden plot. So what are our requirements for a land steward? It needs to be someone who will be there after the installation is done. There needs to be a clear line of authority from the property owner to themselves. Going back to that president of the board, they probably aren't going to go out and pick up branches after a storm, but they can have a person or group that they delegate that accountability to. Usually that person or group is who I would call the land steward. If someone actually lives there, they might be the land steward. If they're not a gardener, though, you'll need to review all of the stewardship responsibilities with them and make sure they understand what's required of them. Ultimately, when nobody else is thinking about the space, that's when the land steward is both reactively managing the land and proactively planning for the future. Without a land steward in place, it's best to pause the project until you know who it is. Any project manager will tell you that without a good vision in place, you're going to stumble around until you either fail or sit down and actually decide on a vision. My favorite definition of a vision is, how will the world be different when our project is done? And I mean it. You're setting out to change the world. To do that, you need to start asking questions. In general, you need to know the current state of things, what needs to change, and why you would do anything at all. All projects should start with a default "don't do it" until you can justify it to yourself and everyone else involved. This leads to fewer, better projects. First, when you're working on your visioning, you need to gather as many of your stakeholders together as you can. If you miss someone, you'll need to follow up with them afterward and review what was discussed. Again, you want to avoid multiple conflicting visions from forming. For gardening projects in your community, there's a lot of questions to ask your stakeholders. Who uses and benefits from the space currently? Are there any maintenance issues with issues with the space? Water, herbivore pressure, failed plantings, weeds. Are there any project goals or focus areas like supporting wildlife, educating residents about gardens or native plants, stormwater management? Are there any aesthetic considerations to take into account? For instance, do they have a particular look they're interested in? What do you hope the use and function of the space will be after the project is complete? And are there any activities during the project that could involve residents or other stakeholders? Next is project chartering. A charter is a short 1 to 2 page document that says what success looks like, which we'll call the goals, what the project will accomplish, which is in scope, what it won't accomplish, which is out of scope, who's in charge and who can approve things, which is generally your executive sponsor, who else is involved in the project, your key stakeholders, what are the hard requirements and important dates, and how will changes be made to the plan, which is called change control. Now, if you've worked in the business world, you might already be convinced that these kinds of documents are a big waste of time. We need to go do stuff, not spend time documenting stuff. Let me give you 2 scenarios, and you can say in the chat which of them you think is better use of time. Scenario 1 is never make a charter, and scenario 2 is make a charter and never read it during the project. Those are your 2 options. So which of these is a better time, number 1 or number 2? Just gonna kind of look at the chat here. Feel free to type in which you think is more better use of time. Not seeing too many chats. Oh, here we are. Seeing, looks like some 2s. Okay. I think we have a consensus around 2. So in my experience, number 2 is the best use of time because you're making the charter is the most, because the best use of time, because making the charter is most of the value of the charter. If you make a good charter, then you have had at least one discussion about your goals, your scope, things that are out of scope, who your people are, requirements and dates, and how you're going to make changes. Also, if you do have a charter on hand and someone new joins the project in the middle, you have a wonderful piece of onboarding they can read to quickly understand what's going on. Lastly, I'll say the charter doesn't have to be a formal document with signatures. As long as everyone has seen it and said, yes, that's what I want to do, that's usually good enough. Sometimes a project document that sort of captures everything is a useful version of that. I know this has been a lot of project management stuff, and I didn't have a lot of interesting pictures. So here's a bumblebee enjoying some goldenrods as a little break. All right, back to project management. I promise we're almost to the gardening stuff. Funding. A lot of people have questions for me about funding. Funding is another one of those chicken or egg things. You might see a great funding source and think of a great project to do it based on, or it might happen in the other order. Funds for smaller projects usually come out of one of a few sources. If you or your organization have funds already, then that's easiest and you can just spend it how you like. You may also find a partner with funds to donate to the project, and you can work with them directly. The most common funding I see for these projects comes in the form of a grant. In general, grants are awarded to nonprofit organizations and a few other types of orgs like HOAs, but not to individuals or to for-profit enterprises. So if you're working with a nonprofit, that's easy enough. You can just apply. If you're an individual or a for-profit enterprise, you can partner with them during the application phase and take on more of a project management role. So here's an example of a funding scenario. There's a community program called a shrub swap, which was mostly recently carried out by some folks in Columbia, Maryland, in one of their villages. You advertise to the community that they can show photos of removing invasive shrubs like this barberry, and then offer free native replacements like this winterberry. Assuming you have the volunteers, the primary cost is the new plants. Through my company, Vibrant Gardening, I'd like to provide native plant expertise and handle plant acquisition. I know that the previous program was funded by Chesapeake Bay Trust's Community Engagement and Restoration Mini Grant, which they just call the Mini Grant, which is worth $5,000. So they're likely to want to fund another one. However, I'm not a nonprofit. Fortunately, I know a nonprofit in my community that is interested, so they can apply for the grant and name me as the project manager. Plus, they will likely be part of the marketing and volunteering solution. I was unsure if there were any rules about how to use the funds, so I reached out to Chesapeake Bay Trust, CBT, and they told me as long as the shrubs were purchased for the grant at a fair market price, that would be just fine, which is what I already do. So, and that's the thing. If you're ever curious about a grant, email the people who are giving out the grant. They will always tell you the answer to your question because they want you to apply for the grant. I'm still working on the details for this one for myself, but really, if you could get the right people together, there's nothing stopping you from pursuing this exact scenario on your own. Okay, let's talk about design. Again, not a comprehensive design presentation, but here's some big tips from my experience. You don't have to be a graphic artist or a landscape architect to write down where you are going to plant natives. Regardless of your background, your 100th design is going to be better than your first. So I advocate for designing lots of small gardens so you can build your skills. One of my biggest takeaways from working at a digital design agency was to spend as little time and money as possible on design documents. While the design is super important, design undergoes change. Really significant change by the time it becomes a real tangible output or product. So getting designs good enough to start building something has to be the primary goal. Here's a design from the HOA swale I'll be discussing in a moment. In clients, I also create a supplemental design presentation that gives a little better sense of the plants they'll be growing and how they'll be arranged. For a community project, usually you don't even need that. If you're building a garden that isn't at someone's house, it's a challenge to keep up with weed pressure, especially in the first few years. If your design puts ground cover plants first, they'll do a lot of the work for you. Sunnier gardens will also generally get more weed pressure because there's more free energy up for grabs. Here I have Pachyra aurea on the left, which can handle a lot of conditions, except very dry, very hot conditions. Here is plantain leaf pussy toes, which can handle a very dry, sunny climate. I caught an American painted lady laying her eggs on her host plant right here. And golden Alexanders, Zizia aurea, can handle very dry, sunny conditions and will bloom throughout most of the year. These are just some examples. Each of these are semi-evergreen, which helps inhibit the germination of winter weeds. If you're designing a public-facing garden, it's important that plants aren't leaping toward passersby. Here's an example of a beautiful patch of black-eyed Susans that are leaning into the sidewalk. To many of us gardeners, this isn't a huge deal, but for folks who have only ever seen formal gardens, it can evoke a sense of disorder. And also, when you're intruding on public spaces such as sidewalks, we want to be mindful of folks who might have a harder time using the sidewalk if it's blocked by floppy stems. So when you are standing at the edge of a bed, look at what you've planted 1 foot in and make sure it won't fall over more than a foot. And 2 feet in, make sure it won't fall over more than 2 feet, and so on, so you don't have those stems falling over the edge. I have also seen this example on the right of the at the Friends School of Baltimore, where they weed the first 6 inches and cover that with a little bit of mulch, and then go pretty wild beyond the edge. And you'll notice they have a stanchion here, but they could also use that gradated planting method here. And it would really, you can see it really tells the passerby that this is both a living space and under human management. Implementation. So plant sourcing is the hardish part. If you've ever filled your car with native plants for a big project, you may recognize this feeling in this picture. It's challenging to find native plants. While a few mainstream nurseries have some natives at the level of quality you'll want, mostly you'll want to source plants from one of the following options. Mail order is often the most efficient. However, you're often ordering plants from out of state, and there'll be no chance of planting local ecotypes. During the spring and fall, there are some very good pop-up sales, which you can usually find on the Maryland Native Plant Society website, and I have sourced plants from those before. It helps to order ahead so you can just pick up everything you need. A single sale may have limited species though, so sometimes the plants, again, were all ordered from an out-of-state grower. One of the best options you can choose is to buy from a brick and mortar native plant retailer. You can often find out more details about the plants, where they were grown, etc. And there are a few organizations in the area like Chesapeake Natives and Bonaterra that specialize in local ecotype plants, meaning the seed was ethically collected in Maryland and the plants have diverse genetics. They're not just clones of one another. Lastly, you can partner with someone who sells out of the wholesale plant trade, which means they have a Maryland plant dealer license. Part of the idea behind Vibrant Gardening is that I can go to one of several Maryland native plant growers who are wholesalers and get almost anything I want and then retail those to folks. Every year, the Maryland wholesalers are improving their stocks for the retail market, so it is making sourcing easier regardless of how you shop. All right, planting. This is sort of the easy part. Once you've got permission to plant, you've got the money, you got a design, you got the plants. That's where you can do your planting. We're all gardeners, so we're already bringing this skill to our projects. However, I have found that in most of my projects, I haven't personally gotten to plant nearly as many plants as I expected. That's because a big part of these projects is managing community involvement. A lot of the time you've got novice gardeners planting, and you need to check that the plants are spaced correctly, getting planted deep enough, and that nothing is getting trampled. So I spend most of my time wandering around from person to person. Planting a community garden with others is an unforgettable experience and can help knit communities closer together. Every time you walk or drive past that garden in the future, you'll feel pride in what you accomplished together. Lastly, we have maintenance. So getting to planting day is like a marathon. After the plants are in the ground, you're going to want to lay down and just breathe for a moment. Plus, your project team will likely shrink or disband after that point. However, if you let maintenance slide, you're putting all your hard work at risk. Be kind to yourself and figure out the plan for the future maintenance and who is going to do it before the end of the project. Whether it be raking leaves into the beds, as you see my partners Stephanie and Megan doing here, or watering or weeding, your new garden is going to need some ongoing support. Plus, the land steward and their support team may need to come in and do unexpected work, such as clearing up fallen branches after a storm. So I know this has been a huge amount of information. I'm sure I could do another whole talk on just topics I didn't get to cover. If you're starting out on community projects, start as small and as simple as you can. If you plant 100 to 200 square feet of new garden, that will have been a serious first project. Once you're done with your first project, you'll be at least twice as smart as when you started. That will make future projects much easier. Also, you'll start to learn more about your strengths and weaknesses. For instance, if you love art and communications but don't like budgeting and scheduling, you might find someone else to do the project stuff so you can focus on communications. It's also okay if you just want to dig holes. You'll still be a better team member by knowing how projects work. Lastly, don't forget to tell everyone what an amazing thing you did. Get on social media, on newsletters, in local government announcements, in your local paper, and give talks about them. This is really, really important. Following my own advice, here's a few projects of my own from the last couple years I'll use as case studies. So this is the Laurel Museum project with Laurel Historical Society and Laurel for the Patuxent. So back in 2023, the director of the Laurel Museum struck up a conversation with Laurel for the Patuxent, our local watershed group, about creating a native garden around the property. The Laurel Museum is owned by the city of Laurel and managed by the Laurel Historical Society. I lived around the corner and volunteered to manage the project, acquire plants, etc. And we identified the museum director as the land steward, as well as an executive sponsor, as they were funding it with their organization's money. And I'll just kind of point out here, you can see sort of some kind of sort of scrubby grass in the front here, but otherwise there's really not much going on at this property. But who did we miss? We already missed somebody in our stakeholders. So, you're free to guess in the chat if you want. We're gonna come back to that. So the museum wanted something low maintenance because their on-site staff would like to have a little time or energy, or would have little time or energy to take care of the garden on their own. It needed to be attractive, engaging to visitors, and also the plants couldn't block a sign they had out front. And they were also interested in joining the growing native plant movement, learning more as a staff about native plants and perhaps educating the community about native gardening in their own homes. So the design, I'm going to just focus on one of the beds we did. It was framed by mulch beds. The building was framed by mulch beds with no plants. However, they did have a number of winterberry in the front bed already, so we designed around those. So you can kind of see we put in ground covers of green and gold here on the left bed here with winterberries. There was a red bud in place already. We had some plantain leaf pussy toes, and we had a few one-offs, things like beard tongues. As it gets sunnier over here, we had orange coneflower right by the exit, along with golden ragwort. And there's many things I would do differently about this bed, but this is where we were, where I was a couple of years ago. Here's some examples of what it looked like grown out. So here's the green and gold that started filling in the area. We raked leaves over everything, so you could kind of see we were trying to use leaf-based mulching. We had black-eyed Susans and some even some goldenrods in here, lots of Pachyra. Like I said, we did get the plantain leaf pussy toes, and I did spot a American painted lady laying eggs. So there's an egg there. However, the plants were growing slower than expected. Um, the beds were densely packed. Unfortunately, we didn't know this until we learned later, with a toxic wood mulch, which I didn't realize was a real thing. It's wooden pallets that were originally used to transport toxic materials, and apparently they'll grind that up and spread it on garden beds, and it's not good for your plants. So we discovered that. We didn't know what had been done previously by the city, but we removed as much of the mulch as we could, and we were hoping that the plants would eventually restore the fertility of the land. And unfortunately, a few weeks ago, a new city staff member pulled out all of the green and gold and pussy toes. The city is generally removing native plants from their garden beds, which is a whole other thing. And they did apologize and have offered some kind of replacement. But as you can see, this was a big blow to the people that worked on the project. And I want to show the whole story just because I think it's important to show successes, but also lessons learned. The lesson learned was if you miss stakeholders, you're going to put your project at risk now or in the future. We just didn't sufficiently engage the city. We really should have said, hey, I know, director, you're speaking to the city about this, but we should probably at least have a meeting and make sure we're on the same page and get buy-in and all that good stuff. So just something to remember for your own future projects. Fortunately, they get better from here. Patuxent Triangle HOA, that's the HOA I'm the president of, which does give me a little bit of extra control over what we get up to. There's only 10 units in our HOA. We're very small, and we're mostly exist to maintain a parking lot. So we had an issue. We had water cascading down our parking lot during storms and rolling right over the sidewalk and into the culvert. This is called the dirtiest first flush, and it is obviously bad for our Patuxent River where this water all goes. You can see it spreading over the sidewalk and the culverts right over here. And generally, this is not a great outcome here with the lawn being flooded like this indiscriminately. So we got some funding from Chesapeake Bay Trust with that grant I mentioned earlier, and we got matching funds from Howard EcoWorks, who we brought on as a partner. So I was the project manager. We had different community members involved. You can see here helping us move some wood chip. We had Howard EcoWorks come in for finishing labor and also all the plants. And our activities were smothering the existing grass in wood chip and then building up the ground with soil. We didn't use the wood chip to build up the ground. So we did remove all that and move it to a neighbor's lawn to start smothering his lawn. And then planting a native swale to help redirect the water. And as you can see, this is the same level of storm. And you can see the water is now being channeled into a drain. And also when it overflows, it goes into a meadow that's up here, a little pocket meadow we maintain. We had some signage so people would know what we were doing. And we have a number of shrubs and things growing in. This is kind of early days. And we did use pine straw as a mulch for the first year. But this has been a really exciting outcome. And again, we had this wonderful flowering. We did get hit pretty hard by the drought last year, but we're hoping this year will be a little bit calmer. And then this is the project I'm perhaps most proud of, which is Laurel Native Habitats. So let's see, let me get my materials. Again, this was with Laurel for the Patuxent. This one, we basically had it was basically a program with Laurel for the Patuxent called the Laurel Native Habitats, and it was funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. which we did in partnership with National Wildlife Federation, which is they're different organizations with similar names. And we selected 5 participants from a pool of homeowners in Laurel who wanted to reduce their front lawns and create new native gardens. The participants then organized into a co-learning cohort. They then each attended not only the on-site consultation of their home, but also we had each of them come to each of the consults for everybody else. So some people had as many as 5 at-home consults where they could, basically learn about each other's homes, see peers operating at the same level as them rather than just talking to me, who I'm an experienced gardener. And really, I can't overstate how impactful this was because the cohort formed bonds quickly to kind of have this kind of co-learning experience. And that led into project planning. So the core part of the project was we were going to have everybody choose an area of their front lawn that was visible from the street and reduce the lawn and turn it into a front yard garden. And so I'm gonna mostly show this through pictures because I didn't have time to write up a million slides on this, but I have some wonderful pictures. So the first thing we did was we partnered with a company called Veterans Tree Service in Laurel, and they're just arborists who were willing to work with us on small chip drops. So basically, they did 5 small chip drops, and so that availability of that partner really made this possible because they were we wouldn't end up with 20 cubic yards we had to move everywhere. We would just get what we needed. So it turns out if you just ask people, sometimes they'll give you what you need. Here's one of our participants with her new giant pile of wood chips. And here is the group. Everybody got together. We did the cohorts together, sorry, consults together. We did moving wood chip together, which was really awesome because we'd actually planned on having to hire labor and we didn't. So that meant people got larger gardens in the end. You can kind of see how we did things here. We got the wood chip laid out. We would measure things out and get it laid out in some kind of design. And then we would put signage up with a little QR code that made it easy for people to find out what was going on. We have our sponsors here. So, and again, I think people really responded positively to seeing that because they know what's going on. Here's a good example of how we started out. So we had some just grass here on this corner, and I said, "Hey, would you like there to be kind of a corner cut to the resident there?" And she said, "Sure." So we basically designed a little pathway through the middle that was going to be left behind, and we did obviously have to move most of the wood chip after it had smothered, and then we planted in densely in these 2 triangles. And that abuts this tree here. So the idea was that there's sort of a tree adjacent to the edge of this garden that's going to take some years to grow in. Here's another one that we did that was kind of in the basin of a kind of culvert area, ditch basically, that's flowing next to the street. And so, here's the resident here who's very dirty and happy after digging out his wood chip, and we planted all of his kind of drought tolerant but water loving plants, so sort of swamp types of plants. Here's one where we designed a pathway up the middle. So we basically just moved all the wood chip to either side. And then up the middle, then there's a walkway right to the front door. So it's sort of an inviting garden. The gardeners had different things they were interested in. This was meant to be a little bit more of a cottage garden that you could kind of walk through and just enjoy. This was more of a wild and tall, again, flooding tolerant garden. And this is meant to be more of like a diverse garden where you can have, she's thinking of putting up little signage of what different plants are for educational purposes to her neighbors. Here's one that I was really proud of. The residents here are from uh, New Mexico, and they missed all of the cacti and things. So I tried to pick a bunch of xeric things here. You can see some prickly pear. We got a yucca in there. Got some grasses that I think will be really good for that. And then we have more of a meadow in the back of this sidewalk garden. So everybody got input on the design. We did the design kind of live and captured notes from that. And this is a corner garden that gets a lot of foot traffic, and there's a stop sign right here that a lot of people stop at. This is actually around the corner from my house. This is my neighbor. They're all where everybody was really close together, and that was part of our design. So there's a little bit of a pathway here, and then the rest of it's being planted. And this did get mulched afterward. But again, the planting was all done communally. Not everybody could make everything, but with 5 participants, it worked out pretty well. And honestly, it was just a really great experience all fall. We planted all 5 gardens in like 9 calendar days. Here's some links to the things I mentioned: the Laurel Museum, Laurel Producent, the grant I mentioned, and my stuff, vibrantgardening.com, and my Facebook page. We're going to be sharing this out as a recording, and also I can share the slides with anybody who's interested. And yeah, that's what I have. So open to questions. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope it was interesting.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. That was great. I have a question for you.
Go ahead.
If I can start. And please start putting your questions into the chat, and Anne can come in and read them off for Jimmy. So I was curious about your first project, about when you said that the city decided that they didn't want to have native plants. Is this something that, did they give any reasoning behind that, or was there a chance to sort of talk about it afterwards?
Uh, it does seem to be something that's happening on a personnel level in the city. It's a little puzzling, but yeah, they're kind of swimming against the stream. So I can't really say more to why, other than that's something I've heard reported internally. They don't think they look good is honestly part of it, but I don't think that's all of it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. And yeah, I'll admit it's made me a little less eager to, work on designs for the city type projects, and I'm just putting my energy elsewhere.
Okay. Looks like we have a question in the chat. I'll go ahead and read that real quick, about if you're using fresh wood chips for mulch.
Yeah, so all of the wood chip we use is from arborists who have just cut down trees for various tree management reasons. That's a waste product that needs to be disposed of. So arborists typically have to pay a tipping fee. So instead, they can deliver it to gardeners who can use it immediately. So it is fresh. It's the whole tree, not just the wood bark. And it's great for smothering grass. It's not great for smothering anything else necessarily, but for grass, super easy to kill it. You need 8 to 12 inches. And then I typically remove all or most of it afterward. And then we'll use something like pine straw as a true mulch. So I'm really not using it as mulch. I'm just using it as smother.
Okay, I think you covered the next one, but they're asking to explain the use of the wood chips from start to finish, so.
Yeah, I think I've mostly covered it. You just need to make sure the edges are nice and tall along the edges so you don't have grass come out the edges. You need to overdo it a little bit on the edges. But otherwise, yeah. Oh, I will say we did have a very important lesson learned over the summer. This was the hottest year in history. And that meant that actually all the wood chip dried out, which I've never had happen before. And it did arrest the hot composting function of the wood chips. So we found that there were some grasses that survived even after 5 weeks. So I've never had that happen before. So if you have extreme drought again, like we did this year, and you're doing deep chipping, you need to actually water it periodically just to make sure it's got a little bit of moisture in there. Otherwise, you're just asking dry things to compost dry things. There's gotta be moisture in there. Typically, there's a lot of moisture in fresh wood chips, so that's not usually a problem.
Okay, next is what tips do you have for making weed management possible for non-gardeners after the installers are not there to help?
Oh, that's a good question. So when we had the museum garden the first year, we had not like a ton of weeds because again, kind of a toxic environment, but we did have a fair number of winter weeds come up. And I literally did an orientation at the beginning. We had volunteers come out, and I just stood there and I said, I'm going to show you each of the plants that are here. Some of them are native plants we planted, and you can kind of see there's a geometry to that I think helps people pick out a new planting from a weed. And then I would pick each of the weeds and kind of talk about the leaves. And that isn't enough. But then part two, again, kind of what I was saying before, I literally just wandered around the whole time and people say, hey, what is this? And I'd say, oh, that's a winter weed. That's hoary bittercress. Go ahead and pull that. Or what's this? Oh, no, this is a violet. So it came up on its own, but we want to keep it because it's a great plant. But
How
yeah,
do you find, oh, next one.
need to be there. Sorry, go ahead.
How do you find out about the possible grants available?
I'll be honest, like I'm not a great expert person at finding new grants, so I've mostly gotten the grants. I mostly know about the grants I know about either through the community, through talking to gardeners, through uh, looking around for them. People do make postings about them on social media. If you follow nonprofits that are grantors, they're usually going to advertise. Also, your county and state do advertise grants as well. So these are all different places, but mostly I've just found that there's a few that are particularly useful, and so I've kind of just followed those.
All right, Jen asked, says, we have a grant to remove Bradford pears from a neighborhood median. There were residents against getting rid of the trees. We want to change the median to native gardens, but it will take time. Do you have tips for keeping all the residents content during the process?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that to a certain extent, you can't expect to please everybody. I've had gardens that like literally I've gotten lots of positive feedback from people, and then also had people say they didn't think it looked good. So, I mean, there are some people who just aren't going to enjoy kind of a native garden. But I would say most people, what they need to know is what's going on. They need to know what you're doing, and they need to know why you're doing it. And then if you're talking to somebody, you can kind of talk them through the process. But really, that's the big thing is communication. If you just are doing stuff in a median and they just see a bunch of weird stuff happening, and then they reach out to their, I don't know, whoever owns the median and say, what are you guys doing? Then you've kind of missed the boat. So I would say put up some signage that says, new native garden coming soon, or removing invasive trees or something like that, and use some of those keywords that people know, maybe some imagery. If you have a conceptual design, you could certainly put a picture of that up so people can see that as well. So yeah, just communicate and over communicate.
Okay, what is pine straw?
It's just pine needles.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. If you have a neighbor with a pine tree who breaks up their pine needles, you can take their pine needles. And that's what I did for the HOA. I have a neighbor across the street who had 2 giant bins of pine needles. And I was like, can I have all of these? And he was like, sure. And that was all my pine needles. You can also buy it as a commercial product if it's, you know, you just don't happen to have a free source of it, but you can also ask around online and probably get some for free. It's very inexpensive to buy.
It's very common in the South. I just want to mention that it's more common, at least in Georgia where my parents live, for people to use the pine straw rather than hardwood mulch. So that's just a regional thing, I guess.
And yeah, and I want to say the reason I use it, when you first, like, I universally want to use whole leaf litter, just the whole leaf, put it down on the bed. But if you do that with tiny little plants, it will blow away. That's my experience. So if you use pine needles, they'll just stay where they are. And then your next year, come back in with your whole leaf and it'll be grabbed by the plants more easily.
Next, I didn't read this ahead of time. I attended a city meeting a few years ago for redoing Washington Square with crepe magnolias. I'm not sure if this is a fait accompli, but hopefully a native was proposed. Sorry, crepe myrtles. Sorry, I should have read the whole thing before I read it out loud. Crepe myrtles. Let's see. Sorry.
And it was just a comment, I think.
Just a comment. Yeah. That is the last question in the chat. If anybody else has anything, you're welcome to raise your hand. But
I have a question.
yeah.
I wanted to kind of ask you a larger question, Jimmy, about the experiences you've had with having these projects bring the community together, just to talk about that a little bit. And
yeah,
the benefits of
definitely.
that.
I think with the museum, it was a little bit of a mixed bag. You know, some people that are regular attendees of the museum are more interested in formal gardens. Other people were very, very excited about it. You know, we gave a talk to the museum, and that was very well attended, and a lot of people were very interested. Kind of like a talk, kind of like this one. So that was good. And also we did involve a number of people from the community, but frankly, we didn't get as many volunteers on that project as we hoped. The HOA project was interesting because it didn't have a lot of involvement from the HOA members. Not many of them are gardeners, and they weren't as, you know, I really made sure they knew about all the stuff we were doing, but we only got a few neighbors to participate. But the people across the street and down the street were actually the main people who came out and were willing to dig for hours in the wood chips. So that's maybe a little indicator that not just the people that like own the property benefit. People walk by these places all the time and they get very engaged with saying, oh, I want there to be beautiful spaces here. So just something to think about. And then with the Laurel Native Habitats program, I mean, frankly, that was just like a magical experience. The people that were involved got so jazzed up for native plants. And frankly, we're hoping that there'll be a second cohort, and that they'll essentially become like a lineage of people converting lawn and moving forward. And meanwhile, we're building, frankly, fairly educated people who've all planted a whole bunch of plants and gotten a lot of, you know, information that they might not otherwise get. So that's for me was the best educational thing that we did.
Did you find that more neighbors were getting to know each other with this and strengthening the community?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody in our cohort said that their neighbors stopped and talked to them and said, hey, you know, what's this thing you're doing? And they said, oh, I'm doing this. And then, you know, they kind of got the word out a little bit. So I do think garden projects do tie people together. Every time I've planted a garden with somebody, it's been a very memorable experience.
So one last question. If somebody wanted to start in their own neighborhood, but they might not be super outgoing, like where do you think would be a good place to start for them to connect with people?
Start with the infrastructure that's there. I think people sometimes feel like they need to just do everything from scratch, but it's just too much for one person, I think, most of the time to just start from nothing. So you can either start with your own property, and then you're learning and you're growing and you're doing the whole thing. And you'll learn a lot of skills from that. And then see if you want to loop in neighbors. So that's one thing you can do. But most of the time, you need to find your local ecological groups or neighborhood or community groups. It doesn't have to be a gardening group, and say, hey, I've got this idea for this space. It seems like it'd be easy to do if only we had some funding or if only we had some extra hands. And just try to like latch onto that, because a lot of organizations are very happy to do stuff as long as there's someone who's willing to lead it. And you don't have to necessarily be, necessarily as outgoing, as long as you're willing to do the hard work of planning and organizing and sending the emails and doing the calendar stuff. And then, hopefully you get some help from the organization. So like Laurel with the Patuxent's been great for me, because they'll often handle a lot of the logistical stuff and website stuff. And I can kind of focus on the plant stuff and the people stuff.
That's great. Yeah, and you have your little happy hour too that you get together with people
That's true. Yeah.
for
We have
your group.
in Laurel, anybody wants to come by, we have a Vibrant happy hour every month. It's in the Laurel area, but anybody's welcome. You can find information about that on the website. I need to get the next date on the calendar.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been a really nice presentation. Thank you, Jimmy. And I hope that some people are inspired to start their own projects in their community and connect with neighbors. You can certainly do it through a church group if you have that connection. You can meet people at plant swaps, and of course garden clubs. We have someone here who is from Garden Clubs of America, your Native Plant Society, and just I first got involved here when I moved here 7 years ago. I was walking my dog and I saw some people planting trees, and I started talking to them, and that was Greenhouse Alliance, and I got sucked into that, and eventually broadened the scope, and now it's Wild Ones. So
Yeah, that's a really good point. Just starting by volunteering with an organization, not trying to lead from the start, is another great decision, because you can learn whether or not that organization is one that you want to do bigger stuff with. And meanwhile, you're, participating and getting out there and doing good works. So yeah, that's a really good point. I started digging holes at a community farm, and that's how I got back into the garden stuff.
yeah, it's fantastic. And then doing talks like this, and um, I have three talks coming up. I'm doing just basics about native plants for different small groups, and just trying to get the word out. And so everybody here, you have the possibility of sharing with your neighbors and getting the word out too. And even just gifting a native plant to somebody, could be enough to get them started. Just even one native plant. So I hope everyone is excited for spring and has lots of success in planning their next garden bed. And hopefully you'll check out our calendar for we've got some garden design events coming up, and we'll have more things on the calendar soon. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anne, for your organization and participation, and everyone else who came. And happy planting, yes, as someone said in the chat. Jimmy, there's some nice comments in the chat, so you might want to take a look at those.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. This has been great. I appreciate your attention. Glad it was helpful.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Okay.
It's great.
Okay. Take care, everybody. Have a great night.